As a teenage prodigy, Steve Winwood's talent was undeniable when he met Spencer Davis at just 14 years old in Birmingham. His voice and musicianship was like a magnet for audiences and for anyone trying to make it in the music industry. But as his skills grew and he found success, so did Steve's ambitions. He found himself pulled in different directions, staying loyal to the bands that brought him success, or following his instincts to explore new musical ground. He would find himself in this position repeatedly throughout the 1960s. The path Steve took would define his career for decades to come, but not without a series of unforeseen obstacles. For musicians, when the stakes are so high, where is the line between loyalty to their bandmates and the freedom to pursue their own creative instincts, especially when other people's livelihoods are at stake? The dilemma between loyalty to others and to ourselves is something that every last one of us will have to confront at some point. Let's explore. When Steve Winwood was a teenager in the 1960s, Birmingham was a hotbed for American rhythm and blues and rock and roll, a sound that young musicians flocked to. The city had a strong tradition of jazz and blues clubs, where American records and touring acts heavily influenced local musicians. With its industrial roots, the city fostered a raw, working-class energy that translated directly into the music. Many used their music as an escape from the life of labor that lay in front of them. An array of bands from the Fortunes to the Moody Blues to Black Sabbath would find their way out of Birmingham and onto the stage. For Steve Winwood, he was playing in Birmingham when Spencer Davis was in the audience and discovered his raw talent. They formed the Spencer Davis Group, playing Chicago blues-influenced songs in clubs throughout England. Spencer began as the lead singer with brothers Steve and Muff Winwood playing the guitar and bass, Pete York on drums. But before long, Steve's vocal prowess led him to be the lead singer. He was just 15 years old. By this point, Steve had gained a reputation as the white kid who sang like Ray Charles. Winwood's voice is soulful, sometimes gravelly, and powerful, with an emotional depth that belies his youth. His unique vocal style has made him one of the most distinctive voices in rock, soul, and blues music. Steve's teachers at school were reading about his shows in papers, and since his school performance was not to their standards, they suggested he not come back, and so he didn't. The group's first professional recording is a cover version of Dimples, released as a single in 1964.
You got dimples in your jaw. You got dimples in your jaw. You got
In late 1965, they gained their first #1 single with Keep On Running, channeling the influence of American R&B legends Ray Charles and Otis Redding. Winwood's ability to mix emotion of blues and energy of rock was what made the song stand out, marking a turning point in the band's career. Steve is just 17 years old.
keep on running. Keep on hiding.
Then in late 1966 and early 67, the group achieved 2 more hits with Gimme Some Lovin', a high-octane R&B hit that became the band's signature song,
This place is hot and I'm so glad we made it.
and I'm a Man, a funky horn-laden riff showcasing the band's ability to merge R&B with a more rock-oriented sound. Both of them sold over 1 million copies and proved to be their breakthrough in the U.S. In 1966, the group starred in the film The Ghost Goes Gear, a British musical comedy. It was not well received and marks the beginning of the end for the Spencer Davis Group.
Right from the start, yeah.
Doesn't Steve look like he could be ripped right out of a page of a 1980s magazine, complete with Converse and all? A premonition, maybe. Steve later said, "We shouldn't have really been making that film." Steve follows his instincts and leaves Spencer Davis Group. He then forays into London's emerging psychedelic scene. In the heart of the city, the most innovative musicians gathered and performed late nights in smoky clubs like the Speakeasy and Bag of Nails, exchanging inspirations that would shape the future of rock music. Much like Tolkien's Inklings, they were feeding off each other's ideas, spontaneous performances which would challenge pop conventions while creating the emerging sound of the era. Steve forms Traffic with drummer and songwriter Jim Capaldi, multi-instrumentalist Chris Wood, and guitarist and songwriter Dave Mason, who will go on to have a long career of his own.
There's only you and me, and we just disagree.
Winwood is looking to make music focused on feeling over technique and collaboration over the standard pop song. After 6 months honing their music, Traffic released their first single, Paper Sun. Their debut song is a top 5 hit and features Mason playing sitar.
We kind of deliberately wanted to remove ourselves from anything that was pop. We really didn't want to be making pop music.
They decide to leave London and live and work together in the countryside as a collective. This pivotal decision to isolate from the distractions of the city will be when they come together in their own in the countryside. In a brick cottage among rolling downs as far as the eye can see, Traffic moves in, isolating themselves from the world, sleeping on mattresses on the floor. They built a concrete stage to play on and spent their time jamming and smoking, day into night, night into day. They explore the inspiring landscapes. Steve explains.
We somehow felt that there was something in the landscape that had some meaning to our music and that it contributed something. And so after we would explore these landscapes, we'd then go back and immediately play and find that in some way this was affecting us and affecting our minds and affecting the music we were playing. The main reason behind it was that we wanted to be able to play any time of the day, any time of night, loud with our instruments, which we couldn't do in London. We couldn't get together and play music every time, every night we wanted.
And there was an old keeper's cottage at the end, and I think we got it for £2 a week or something. You know, there was some very strong vibrations in that place.
There was nothing there. It was just rolling downs as far as you could see. And there's one brick house sitting out in the middle of nowhere.
You know, we just ate when we wanted to eat, we woke up when we wanted to wake up, and we played when we wanted to play.
We built a big concrete stage out in the front of it. And in summer, we just set up out there, you know, stacks of Marshalls and shit and PAs.
We'd have the Hammond organ, drums, you know, everything, and just the downs, just the Berkshire Downs in front of us, and the kind of mixture of the Berkshire Downs. And I'd drawn this character, you know, playing a guitar with puppet hands instead of, you know, his own hands. And I wrote a letter next to it, "Dear Mr. Fantasy, you know, play us a tune."
Dave Mason would often venture off into his own and write songs, including Hole in My Shoe, which will prove to be a huge pop hit in England. He also sings lead on the song. The other members hate it. Dave explains the tensions that arise from this.
It just became those three and me.
He was off on another road to us, which is fine, but the fact remained it wasn't the same route that we were going. He wanted to write completely alone and get us as a band to play his composition. So we wrestled with that and then really kicked Dave out of the band because it was completely opposite to what Traffic had ever wanted to do.
However, after Dave's departure, they find themselves in the position of needing his musical contributions, particularly as a songwriter and guitarist.
He came in sort of as a guest to play a few songs, but he was never really joined the group.
Later, they invite him back for the second album. Again, he writes another hit song.
Oh, Dave Mason, he was nothing more than an invited guest. I mean, that's how he captured me. Made the album, you know, what are we going to put out for a single? Well, we're going to put Feeling All Right out as a single. Now my songs were being picked as the singles again. I guess that created some animosity somewhere.
The tensions arise again, and they kick him out of the band again.
The only thing I could think of was jealousy. But why? The guy is so enormously talented, it's ridiculous.
Was this a case of difference of creative visions, or was it a case of child prodigy syndrome, where there can only be one star?
There was a band meeting, and, okay, what's going on, guys? Well, basically, man, we don't like the way you sing or play or write, or do anything. We just want you out of the band. And that's how it ended.
Pete Townsend came down a lot and jammed. Eric would come down. Bonzo, our dear mate from Birmingham, from Led Zeppelin, he came by and jammed with us a lot.
Without Dave Mason, they head to San Francisco as a trio and hang out with another band who is living together while creating music, the Grateful Dead.
I vaguely remember going to the airport, picking the guys up, bringing them back to our place in the city. You know, it was just sort of a welcome gesture, you know, and let's wig out a little bit. And they were game, which we pretty much figured they would be. It takes commitment to form a band like the Grateful Dead or like Traffic. I think living together, there's no substitute for that. They were an improvisational band like the Grateful Dead were. They were kindred spirits, very much so.
Another band who is improvising heavily is Cream.
It didn't work because we all just ended up jamming on our own. And I thought again of Steve.
Eric ends up leaving Cream, and the time is right, finally, to join forces with Steve Winwood. Steve explains how his bandmates in Traffic felt when he left, as well as his own beliefs on this matter.
It was felt by Jim and Chris that there was an element of disloyalty on my part, and they're probably right, but I thought that I should be free to make music in whatever way I wanted to. I felt that was a right that I should have. So leaving one band and going with another was just part of those freedoms at the time.
Eric and Steve form Blind Faith, and Ginger Baker shows up and is eager to join, much to Eric's apprehension.
I thought we could meet somewhere in the middle of what he'd been trying to do with Traffic, with the unskilled labour mates kind of experiment, and the virtuosity experiment that we'd tried with Cream. If we started with the two of us, then we could put a band around that. While we were doing that one night, there was a knock at the door, and there was Ginger. You know, and he just sort of came in and made himself a cup of tea. I do remember feeling a sense of disappointment.
I thought Ginger was a great player, but obviously he has a certain style.
God bless him. I love Ginger dearly, but he did represent something that I was trying to leave behind, you know.
They debuted in London's Hyde Park in 1969 in front of a frenzied 10,000 fans waiting to see Cream and Traffic's combined prowess. They will be the first to be labeled as a supergroup. This was the opposite of what Clapton was hoping for. There were huge expectations, especially on Steve as the lead singer. Their only album, Blind Faith, includes Can't Find My Way Home, written by Steve Winwood. It is a delicate yet deeply affecting song that showcases Winwood's ethereal vocals and a sense of longing. Lyrically, the song is open to interpretation, but is often seen as a reflecting disillusionment, spiritual searching, and exhaustion. The album met with mixed response from critics, and a cover shrouded in controversy featured an 11-year-old girl. They were forced to issue the album with a different cover with the band in the United States. In an August 1969 review, The Village Voice found none of the songs exceptional and said, "I'm almost sure that when I'm through writing this, I'll put the album away and only play it for guests, unless I want to hear Clapton. He is at his best here because he's kept in check by the excesses of Winwood, who is rapidly turning into the greatest wasted talent in music." They subsequently played concerts in Scandinavia and the US, but the lack of material in the live set led them to play old Cream and Traffic songs, which pleased the audience but disillusioned the band. Clapton became increasingly isolated during the tour, preferring to spend time with the support act Delaney and Bonnie, and Blind Faith disbanded immediately after their last performance. Eric walked away from Blind Faith in the same way Steve had walked away from Traffic and Spencer Davis. Steve retreats into the mystical English countryside, but he wasn't finished with Traffic after all. With Jim Capaldi and Chris Wood, they reformed Traffic, with John Barleycorn Must Die being the band's comeback album. The album featured influences from jazz and blues, but the version of the traditional English folk tune that provided the album's title, John Barleycorn, was also showed the musicians attending to a modern interpretation of traditional folk music. As the 1970s bid goodbye to the 60s, Traffic emerged in the rock album culture with long tours. While on tour, Steve is sickly and eventually is sent home where his appendix burst. Their next LP, The Low Spark of High-Heeled Boys in 1971, went platinum in the US, establishing Traffic as a leading progressive rock band. In 1973's Shootout at the Fantasy Factory, and in 1974's When the Eagle Flies were further top 10 successes for the band in the US. In 1974, Traffic broke up again. Then the rise of punk rock came with daggers pointed at 60s musicians like Steve Winwood. Steve retreated into the countryside. As the 1980s emerged, a transformation in Steve Winwood began as he embarked on a solo career. The disillusionment of the 1970s behind, Steve tapped into his optimism and ability to communicate freedom into his 1980s songs. And the former hippie children of the 60s, now adults, loved it. In 1980, Winwood released his second solo album, Ark of the Diver, which includes his first solo hit, While You See a Chance. This was followed by Talking Back to the Night in 1982, which featured the song Valerie. Both albums were recorded at his home and with Winwood playing all the instruments. His success in the 80s was partly owed to his searching spirit of the 60s, which his fans recognized, albeit with a different sound. Lyrically, Higher Love is an extension of Winwood's optimism. Traffic's songs often explore transcendence, nature, and a desire for something greater. Higher Love taps into the same longing. A fixture on MTV and 3 Grammy Awards for Back in the High Life, Steve Winwood was a bona fide 80s rock star. In 1986, he had already lived multiple musical lifetimes, from his teenage years fronting the Spencer Davis Group to crafting jazz-tinged psychedelia with Traffic and pioneering blues rock with Blind Faith. But rather than being a departure from his past, Back in the High Life was a modernized version of the essence of what made Winwood's 1960s music resonate in the first place. A soulful reflection of self-examination, but also hinted at transformation and moving forward. Roll With It and its title track hit number 1 in the US album and singles charts in the summer of 1988. Roll With It was a direct continuation of what made Winwood's 1960s music stand out, especially his deep love of American R&B, blues, and soul. Steve's instincts he followed in the 60s when he walked away from his bands was simply him adapting to the changing scene. He parlayed that adaptability into his success in the 1980s, and his lyrics rang true with his 60s fans as well as his new younger audience. So his instincts proved to be right to move with the changing scene. It was a risk that paid off, and it meant his own survival later on. Steve Winwood had been recreating himself the entire time, always using emotion to captivate the audience and his ability to communicate his innate tendency towards freedom throughout. While Roll With It fit perfectly into the radio landscape of the 1980s, its spirit was pure 1960s rhythm and blues. More than any other album from his solo career, it brought Steve Winwood back to the raw driving sound that made him a star in the first place. Roll With It felt less like a reinvention and more like a homecoming, a return to the music that first inspired him as a young prodigy in the clubs of Birmingham.
You got dimples in your jaw. You got dimples in your jaw.